Hey guys, tonight we're going to step away from the usual royal drama, though don't worry, there's plenty of that waiting in the wings. And instead, we're going to sink into a very specific kind of atmospheric misery. We're going back to 1816, a year that has many names, none of them particularly cheerful. Some called it the poverty year, others 1800 and froze to death. It was a time when the weather simply gave up. And because history is nothing if not a series of unfortunate events happening to people who were mostly just trying to have a decent breakfast, it turned into one of the weirdest, most melancholy years on record. So dim those lights, get as comfortable as you possibly can, and let's just float back to a world where the sun was a mere suggestion and the sky stayed a dusty, bruised purple for months on end. It all started, as many things do, with a massive explosion that nobody in Europe or North America actually knew had happened. We have to travel all the way to Mount Tambora on the island of Sumbawa in what is now Indonesia. In April 1815, this mountain decided it no longer wanted to be a mountain and instead preferred to be a giant sulfurous crater. It was the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history. It was loud, it was violent, and it sent an unimaginable amount of volcanic ash and silicate dust into the stratosphere. Now, usually when a volcano goes off, it's a local tragedy. But Tambora was overachieving. It created a massive cloud of sulfate aerosols that acted like a giant planetary parasol, reflecting sunlight back into space and cooling the Earth down. Of course, back in 1815 and 1816, people didn't have satellite imagery or climate models. They just had increasingly cold toes and a growing sense of existential dread. They didn't know a volcano halfway across the world had essentially canceled summer. They just thought the universe was finally, officially done with them. By the time the spring of 1816 rolled around in the Northern Hemisphere, things started getting weird. In a normal year, you expect the birds to sing, the flowers to bloom, and the mud to dry up. But in 1816, the mud just froze. In May, frost was still gripping the ground in New England. By June, people were waking up to several inches of snow in places like Massachusetts and New York. Imagine being a farmer in 1816. You've planted your corn, you're looking forward to the harvest, and suddenly it's June 6th and there's a blizzard. Because why not? It's not like you needed to eat or anything. The atmosphere during this time was described as a constant, dry fog. It wasn't a normal fog that burned off when the sun came up. It was a thick, hazy veil that reddened the sun and made the moon look like a bruised plum. It never rained away, it just hung there, dimming the world. It was very aesthetic, I suppose, if you're a fan of Gothic novels, but for anyone trying to grow a potato, it was a literal nightmare. And because humans are nothing if not consistent, when the weather gets weird, we start looking for someone to blame. Since they didn't know about Mount Tambora, people came up with all sorts of creative theories. Some thought Benjamin Franklin's lightning rods were sucking all the heat out of the atmosphere, because obviously a few metal sticks are more powerful than the sun. Others thought the end of the world was finally here, which, considering the snow in July, wasn't a totally unreasonable guess. The impact on the common people was, to put it mildly, pretty grim. Crops failed everywhere. In Ireland, the wheat and potato crops were ruins by the cold and constant rain. This led to the first great famine of the 19th century, accompanied by a massive typhus epidemic because, apparently, Mother Nature felt the freezing cold wasn't quite enough of a challenge. In Switzerland, people were reduced to eating famine foods like moss and sawdust. It's hard to imagine a more sleepless historian vibe than sitting in a dark, cold cabin, chewing on a piece of bark, and wondering why the sun hasn't come out in 3 weeks. But let's float over to the elites for a moment, because even when the world is ending, the rich and famous manage to make it about their own personal dramas. This is where we find our favorite group of high society disasters, Lord Byron, Percy B. Shelley, and Mary Godwin, who would soon become Mary Shelley. In the summer of 1816, this merry band of eccentric, emotionally turbulent poets decided to take a holiday at the Villa Diodati by Lake Geneva in Switzerland. They were expecting a lovely, sun-drenched retreat full of boating, wine, and probably a fair amount of scandalous behavior. Instead, they got 1816. It rained constantly, it was freezing, the wind howled off the lake like a banshee. They were essentially trapped inside a dark, gloomy villa for days on end, with nothing to do but look at each other and contemplate their own brilliance. Now, if you put a group of highly dramatic, sleep-deprived, and slightly bored writers in a dark house during a climate catastrophe, you're going to get some interesting results. To pass the time, Lord Byron, who was essentially the 19th century version of a moody rock star with way too many silk robes, suggested they each write a ghost story. He probably did this with a very theatrical sigh while lounging on a chaise longue. This little "let's write something spooky" challenge is where we get two of the most famous monsters in literary history. Mary Shelley, who was only 18 at the time, struggled with her story for a few days. She had a waking dream, likely a result of the oppressive atmosphere and too much coffee or laudanum, where she saw a pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing she had put together, and thus Frankenstein was born. It's fitting, really, that one of the most famous stories about a creature made of dead parts and brought to life in a storm was written during a summer that felt like it was already dead. Meanwhile, Lord Byron's personal physician, John Polidori, was also there. Polidori was a bit of a tragic figure himself, constantly bullied by Byron and generally feeling like the uncoolest person in the room. He took a fragment of a story Byron had started and turned it into The Vampire. This was the first time we saw the vampire as an aristocratic, brooding, suave villain, rather than a mindless, shambling corpse. So if you like Twilight or Dracula, you can thank a massive Indonesian volcano and a really miserable vacation in Switzerland for the aesthetic. While the poets were inventing science fiction and modern vampires, the rest of the world was just trying not to starve. In the United States, the year without a summer acted as a massive catalyst for westward expansion. Farmers in New England, tired of seeing their crops freeze in August, packed up their wagons and headed to the Midwest, hoping for more reliable weather. It's a bit ironic, really. The search for warmth led people to Ohio, which isn't exactly known for its tropical climate, but hey, compared to snow in July, it probably looked like paradise. The economic fallout was massive. Grain prices skyrocketed. In Great Britain, the bread riots were a reality. In France, the government was struggling to maintain order in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, and the famine certainly didn't help. It was a time of immense social unrest, all because of a thin layer of dust sitting 20 miles above the Earth's surface. There's a certain dry irony in how the weather affects human history. We like to think of ourselves as the masters of our fate, building empires and writing grand philosophies. But one big mountain in the Pacific goes pop, and suddenly we're all eating sawdust and writing books about reanimated corpses. Let's look a bit closer at the people living through this. Can you imagine the sheer confusion? There was no internet, no global news cycle. If you lived in a small village in Vermont, you didn't know about the famine in Ireland or the volcanic dust in the stratosphere. You just knew that your sheep were dying, your corn was black and shriveled, and the sun looked like a dull copper coin. It must have felt like a very slow, very quiet apocalypse, a whisper rather than a bang. In the German states, the situation was particularly dire. This period became known as the Hungerjahre, the Hunger Years. The price of bread increased tenfold in some areas. People were selling everything they owned just to buy a loaf of bread. It's said that the desperation was high, that people would follow grain carts, hoping a single kernel might fall into the mud. And through all of this, the sky remained that eerie, dusty gray. Even the art of the period changed. If you look at the paintings of J.M.W. Turner from around this time, you'll see these incredibly vivid, almost violent sunsets, deep reds, oranges, and purples. For a long time, people thought he was just being an eccentric artist, but modern scientists have analyzed the colors in his paintings and realized he was accurately capturing the effect of the volcanic aerosols in the atmosphere. He was painting the literal remains of Mount Tambora hanging over the English Channel. It's also the year we got the hobby horse, the precursor to the bicycle. Why? Because the price of oats went so high that people couldn't afford to feed their horses, and many horses died or were eaten. A German inventor named Karl von Drais decided humans needed a way to get around that didn't require an animal that needed to eat. So he invented a wooden frame with 2 wheels that you pushed with your feet. It looked ridiculous, and you probably looked like a very desperate, very tired gentleman while using it, but it was direct response to the climate-driven horse shortage. The atmosphere during this time was described as a constant dry fog. It wasn't a normal fog that burned off when the sun came up. It was a thick, hazy veil that reddened the sun and made the moon look like a bruised plum. It never—
Oh, we've looked at the jaws that couldn't chew and the blood that wouldn't clot. It's quite the medical chart we're building for the elites of history, isn't it? But sometimes, the most fascinating royal meltdowns weren't happening in the blood or the bone, but in the mind. And that brings us, quite gently, to George III of Great Britain. Now, poor George gets a bit of a bad rap in the history books, especially if you're reading them on the American side of the Atlantic. He's usually portrayed as the stubborn, tyrannical villain who lost the colonies. But if we peel back the political drama, we find a man who was actually quite charmingly boring, until his own biology decided to stage a coup. The Farmer King's quiet life. George wasn't your typical debauched monarch. He didn't have a string of mistresses. In fact, he was famously devoted to his wife Charlotte, and they had 15 children together. 15. Talk about a full house. He liked agriculture, he liked clocks, and he liked the simple things. They called him Farmer George because he'd rather talk about crop rotation and manure than court intrigue. But then the madness started. And when I say madness, I don't mean he just got a bit grumpy. I mean he began to unravel in ways that were both deeply tragic and, in a very dry, ironic sense, kind of bizarre. Imagine you're a servant at Windsor Castle. The hallways are quiet, the candles are low, and suddenly you see the King of England standing in the garden having a very long, very earnest conversation with the tree. And not just any conversation, he's convinced the tree is the King of Prussia. He's discussing international diplomacy with an oak. Because, of course, why wouldn't the King of Prussia be disguised as a British hardwood? It makes as much sense as anything else in the 18th century. The Blue Secret. During his bouts of illness, George would talk until he literally foamed at the mouth. He would repeat himself for hours, his voice growing hoarse, his mind racing faster than his tongue could keep up with. He became physically violent, he developed tremors, and most curiously, and this is where the historians get their detective hats on, his urine was reportedly a dark purplish blue color. For a long time, people just said he was mad, but modern science suggests something called porphyria. It's a rare genetic blood disorder that can cause neurological issues, physical pain, and yes, that very specific blue-tinged urine. So, while his doctors were busy trying to cure him with blisteringly hot baths and restraining chairs, because 1700s medicine was essentially just organized torture, the king was likely suffering from a metabolic meltdown. The tragedy here is the contrast. Here was a man who valued order, family, and his quiet gardens, forced into a regency where his son, a man who was George's polar opposite in every way, basically waited for him to lose his mind so he could take over the party. It was a slow, agonizing fade into the shadows for a king who just wanted to talk about turnips. The sad, sickly, and spoiled, the French dauphins. But let's float across the English Channel for a moment, away from the chatty trees of Windsor and over to the glittering, gold-leafed nightmare that was Versailles. If you want to talk about a place where being a child was both a luxury and a death sentence, look no further than the French royal line.
The Dauphin was the title given to the heir to the French throne, and being the Dauphin was, to put it mildly, a bit of a cursed gig. Take the children of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Before the revolution turned their lives into a political thriller, their lives were a series of medical tragedies wrapped in silk. The first Dauphin, Louis Joseph, was the golden child. He was brilliant, charming, and the pride of his parents. But by the age of 7, his body began to twist. He developed tuberculosis of the spine, Pott's disease. This proud little prince, the future king of France, spent his final years in a convalescence chair, his spine curving into a painful hunch, watching his younger brother play from the window. He died just as the French Revolution was beginning to simmer. In a way, he was the lucky one. He missed the guillotine, but he paid for it with a slow, fragile decline. The king who vanished. Then there was his younger brother, Louis Charles, who became the Dauphin after Louis Joseph's death. This poor kid's life is one of the saddest chapters in the whole dysfunctional royal handbook. When the revolution hit, he was plucked from the luxury of Versailles and tossed into a dark, damp cell in the Temple prison. The revolutionaries didn't just want to kill the monarchy, they wanted to re-educate the prince. They gave him to a cobbler named Antoine Simon, who was instructed to turn the Capet boy into a good little citizen. It was a brutal transition, from silk beds to a straw mattress, from being called Your Majesty to being cursed at and forced to sing revolutionary songs. He died at the age of 10, officially of tuberculosis, but unofficially of profound neglect and a broken spirit. The mystery of what happened to him, whether he died in that cell or was spirited away and replaced by a commoner, fueled decades of lost Dauphin conspiracies. Dozens of men later popped up claiming to be the grown-up Louis Charles. It was the 19th century version of an internet hoax, except people actually fought duels over it. The spoiled rot. It's a strange irony, isn't it? These children were the most important people in the world from the moment they took their first breath. They were surrounded by hundreds of servants whose only job was to make sure they never felt a draft or stubbed their toe. And yet, because of the stifling etiquette and the limited gene pools, they were often the most vulnerable. At Versailles, a royal birth was a public event, literally. People would crowd into the queen's bedroom to watch the baby be born. It was like a high-stakes sporting event with more lace and less dignity. From that second on, the child wasn't a person, they were an asset, a piece on a chessboard. They were fed rich foods that ruined their teeth, kept in stuffy rooms that bred germs, and married off to strangers before they even hit puberty. Is it any wonder they grew up a little off? When your entire existence is a performance, the human part of you tends to get a bit lost in the costumes. Let's let that sink in for a moment. The quiet gardens of a mad king, the curving spine of a dying prince, and the cold cell of a boy who lost a kingdom he never even got to rule. It's all very heavy, in a soft, distant sort of way.
All right, let's gently drift across the English Channel. Leave behind the scent of French perfume and the looming shadow of the guillotine. We're landing in Georgian England, a place that was, on the surface, very orderly, very Enlightenment, and very proper. But if you scratch that polished mahogany surface, you find a royal family that was, to put it mildly, a bit of a disaster zone. We're talking about the House of Hanover. The Hanovers were German princes brought over to rule England because they were the most Protestant relatives the British could find, and they brought with them a very specific family tradition, hating their own children. It was practically a job requirement. George I hated George II. George II hated Frederick, the Prince of Wales. And George III, well, he had 15 children, so he had plenty of opportunities for complicated feelings. But George III is famous for something else. He's the Mad King. Now, modern historians think he likely suffered from porphyria, a genetic blood disorder that can cause blue urine, skin sensitivity, and most importantly, periods of intense mental confusion and mania. Imagine being the most powerful man in the British Empire and suddenly finding yourself talking to an oak tree because you're convinced it's the King of Prussia. Of course he did, because when you're a Hanoverian, even your hallucinations have to be aristocratic. George III's madness was a slow-motion tragedy. He was actually a very decent man. He loved his wife, Charlotte. They actually liked each other, which was rare for royals. He loved farming, and he loved his clocks. They called him Farmer George. He was the kind of guy who would have been perfectly happy as a country squire, but instead he had to deal with the American Revolution and his own disintegrating brain. During his bouts of illness, the court was a place of hushed whispers and absolute terror. The doctors of the time, who were about as useful as a screen door on a submarine, treated him with blistering and purging. They would literally burn his skin to draw out the humors or force him to vomit. And when he was too agitated, they put him in a straitjacket. It's a very quiet, very sad image. A king of England tied up in a chair, rambling incoherently about his lost colonies, while a doctor applies hot cups to his back. But while George III was suffering in the shadows of Windsor Castle, his eldest son was living it up in London. This brings us to George IV, the Prince Regent, or Prinny to his friends, though he didn't have many real ones. If his father was Farmer George, Prinny was the first gentleman of Europe, a title he gave himself because why wait for someone else to notice how great you are? Prinny was the ultimate Regency disaster. He was incredibly handsome as a young man, but he had the self-discipline of a golden retriever in a ham factory. He was obsessed with three things: fashion, architecture, and eating. He spent so much money on clothes and furniture that he was constantly in debt, debts that would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars today. He built the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, which looks like an onion-domed Indian palace decided to move to the English seaside and have a nervous breakdown. It's beautiful in a more is never enough kind of way. But it's his personal life where things get truly rhythmically messy. He secretly and illegally married a Catholic widow named Maria Fitzherbert, but because he needed Parliament to pay off his massive debts, he had to marry a proper Protestant princess. Enter Caroline of Brunswick. The first time George met Caroline, he walked to the other end of the room and asked for a glass of brandy. Caroline, for her part, said he was much fatter than his portrait. It was a match made in a very cold, very sarcastic circle of hell. George spent their wedding night passed out in the fireplace, drunk. They managed to produce one heir, Princess Charlotte, and then essentially spent the rest of their lives trying to destroy each other. George banned Caroline from the court. She moved to Italy, where she allegedly had an affair with her servant, and lived a life that was described as highly eccentric. When George was finally crowned king after his father died, Caroline showed up at Westminster Abbey, literally banging on the doors, demanding to be let in so she could be crowned queen. George had the guards turn her away. She died shortly after, probably from the sheer exhaustion of being married to a man who wore a corset so tight he frequently fainted. As George IV aged, his excesses caught up with him. He became so obese that he was dubbed the Prince of Wales. He became a recluse at Windsor, surrounded by his mistresses and his gin, obsessed with the idea that he had personally led a cavalry charge at the Battle of Waterloo, a battle he never even attended. He was just a sad, bloated man living in a fantasy world, wearing enough cherry brandy-soaked silk to cover a small village. When he finally died, the Times of London wrote an obituary that basically said, "He was a man who had no friends and will be missed by no one." Brutal, but also, in the context of the Hanovers, almost expected. Let's float away from George's silk-lined bedroom now. Let the sound of his heavy breathing and the clinking of his decanters fade into the distance. We're moving toward a different kind of royal burden. We're going to head east toward the vast, snowy plains of Russia, to a family that makes the Hanovers look like a functional group of Sunday school teachers. We're talking about the Romanovs, specifically the tragic, mystical, and deeply insular world of the last Tsar, Nicholas II, and his wife, Alexandra. If the Hanovers were about excess, the last Romanovs were about a very quiet, very pious kind of doom. They were a family that wanted to live in a middle-class bubble while sitting on a throne of absolute autocracy. They were obsessed with their children, specifically their son Alexei, who carried the royal disease, hemophilia, that had traveled through the family tree, starting with Queen Victoria. Imagine the tension in that palace. Every time the young heir tripped or bumped his knee, it wasn't just a bruise, it was a potential death sentence. Every scraped elbow was a national crisis. This desperation led them into the arms of a Siberian mystic named Rasputin, a man who smelled like a goat and claimed to have the power of God in his hands. But let's save the mad monk and the falling snow of St. Petersburg for the next part of our journey. For now, just feel the cold air beginning to swirl around you. The English Regency is gone. The Brighton Pavilion has vanished into the mist. We're moving toward a world of icons, incense, and the slow, inevitable creak of a collapsing empire. Breathe in the cold air. Feel the weight of the furs. We'll be in Russia soon, but for now, just drift. Slowly, gently.